Hey kids, Flexing Teacher Weber here. I hope you're having a good day. In class, we've started a new unit on ratio and rate. And specifically, today we started looking at ratios. Ratios are used to make comparisons between different objects or different items, different materials. They're used to make comparisons. And so we thought we would do an activity today where we did a little survey to make some ratios. So what I did is I asked the students, I gave them a choice of 3 activities and I asked them to choose their favorite activity. And then we used that data to make some ratios. So I'll use the data from one class which worked out quite nicely to show as an example. One class of 20 students, when each student was asked their favorite activity, 8 students chose sports. 8 students chose screen time, and 4 students chose dance or crafts or things like that, for a total of 20 students. And then we use that data to make some ratios. So the first ratio I ask kids to make is the ratio of those who chose to play sports compared to the total. So those who chose to play sports were 8, and there was a total of 8, 4, 20 people involved in the survey. So if you're comparing sports to the total, the ratio would be 8 to 20. And there's a couple of different ways we can write that. We can write it as 8 to 20 like that. Or we can write it at 8:20 like that. Now, this is a part to whole ratio. It's a part to whole ratio comparing a part to a whole. So it is okay to write that ratio as a fraction. So we can also write this as 8/20 like that, comparing those who play sports or would prefer to play sports to the total number of people surveyed. And since it's okay to write that as a fraction, it's okay to write that as a decimal and a percent. So the fraction 8/20, we could make that a decimal. We could make it out of 100 if we wanted, by timesing by 5, times by 5, and we'd get 40 out of 100. That means that's the decimal. 0 and 40 hundredths, or even simpler, it could just be 0 and 4/10. And it's also a percent, right? Percent is out of 100, so this is also 40%. So 40% of the students in the class would prefer to play sports. So that's called a part to whole ratio. And we can write that as a fraction, a decimal, and a percent. We can also write it in these 2 forms as well. Now let's look at another ratio. This one, I asked, what is the ratio of those who chose screen time to artistic activities? So I'm going to go back to the data here. Screen time was 8, and artistic activities was 4. So that ratio we could write as 8:4, or 8:4. Now this is called a part-to-part ratio because it's comparing 2 parts. It's not comparing a part and a total. And so since it's a part-to-part ratio, it is not okay to write these as a fraction, a decimal, or a percent. Remember, fractions compare a part of a whole or a part of a group. So since this is not a part to a whole, we can't write this as a fraction. Now, what we can also do with ratios is we can put them in lowest terms. So if I took this ratio 8:4, the greatest common factor of 8 and 4 is 4, so I could divide both of these parts by 4. And this ratio in lowest terms would be 2:1. That ratio is in lowest terms. So ratios do have many similarities to fractions, but they aren't always written as fractions when you're talking about a part-to-part ratio. Let's look at another example. This question says, what's the ratio of those who chose sports to screen time to artistic activities? Well, I think those who chose sports was 8. Screen time was 8. And artistic activities was 4. And the order matters, right? It has to be sports first, then screen time, and then artistic activities. So it has to go in that order. And remember, we could also write it like this: 8 to 8 to 4. And we could also put that in lowest terms, right? By dividing by the greatest common factor of all three numbers, which is 4. So we could divide by 4, divide by 4, divide by 4. And in lowest terms, this ratio would be 2 to 2 to 1. So that's just a little introduction to ratios. Ratios are used to make comparisons, and there's different kinds of ratios. There's part to part and part to whole. And then it's just important that we can, write ratios in lowest terms, no matter what form they're in. So if you look at this one in number 1, we're going to write each of these ratios in lowest terms. You'd want to find the greatest common factor of 12 and 18, which is 6. You would divide both of those parts by 6. In this case, the ratio is written as a fraction. And in lowest terms, this ratio would be 2 to 3. Right, and it could also be written as 2 to 3 or 2 to 3. This ratio here, we have it written as 14 to 21. So to put it in lowest terms, you need to find the greatest common factor of 14 and 21. I believe it's 7. 2 times 7 is 14. 3 times 7 is 21. So you could do divide by 7, and you would get 2 to 3. Just like the previous one. And it works for 3-term ratios as well. But you have to find the greatest common factor of all 3 terms of the ratio. In this case, 10 to 15 to 35, the greatest common factor is 5. So we could divide all 3 parts by 5, and we would get 2 to 3 to 7. I went a little bit 2 to 3 crazy in this activity. So that's the ratio in lowest terms or simplest form. And just one more example, the ratio 20 to 40 to 60. To get this ratio in simplest form or lowest terms, you would divide by the greatest common factor of all 3 numbers. It is 20. So divide by 20, divide by 20, divide by 20. And you would get 1 to 2 to 3. And that's the ratio in lowest terms. So those are some of the introductory activities we will do with ratios. And then the eventual goal in this section is to start using ratios to do something called proportional reasoning and problem solving. This will help with the activity that the kids get today. That's all for now. Flexing Teacher Weber out.